Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for watching us. Thank you for all the people who've been coming and joining part of this continuing series. We have another special guest, part of our continuing series, where we're talking to professors, scholars, reporters, thinkers, anybody from around America, the left, the right. We don't care what you say. We just want to have in-depth, detailed, specific, intelligent conversations because we find the media isn't doing that. With us today is Professor Kevin VALLIER. He is the author of Trust in a Polarized Age. You can see it there on the cover. We'll get to that in a second. Kevin VALLIER is an associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University, where he directs their program in philosophy, politics, economics, and law. VALLIER's interests lie primarily in political philosophy, ethics, religion and politics, political economy, trust, and political polarization. He's the author of 4 monographs, 5 edited volumes, and over 50 peer-reviewed book chapters and journal articles. Did I get anything wrong there? Is there something you'd like to
All
add to the
good.
bio?
That's very kind.
Okay. Well, let me ask you about the book because it relates directly to what this interview series is about, political polarization. You already wrote this book. This book, I believe, is 1 or 2 years old, maybe a little bit older.
3 years now. Yes.
3 years.
Yeah.
What were you seeing 3 years ago? And then I'll ask you about now. What did you see 3 years ago before January 6th, where you said,
COVID.
I need to write a book about how bad polarization is? I mean, because for a lot of people, January 6th was the wake-up call. I already knew there were problems, but you're a professor, you study this, and you're already picking up on something a year, 2 years before January 6th. What were you seeing that said, things are bad, I need to jump into this debate?
So my work early on in my graduate work was focused on conflicts in religion and politics in the United States. And I'd already been attuned to a lot of the conflicts that had sort of gotten really out of control. And also some of the conflicts that were already there and were already pretty severe, like abortion. But I was writing a lot about religious exemptions. For instance, the debates about, the little sisters of the poor and the Obamacare stuff. And so I'd already kind of had my ear close to the ground on some of these conflicts in religion and politics that had been sort of bouncing around the courts, that had been a matter in public discourse. And so as I was finishing up working on that particular project, I started to ask a sort of more abstract question, which was, okay, well, it seems like a lot of conflicts in this country are getting worse and more heated all at once. What's going on? It's not just the subset that I'm focused on. It seems like everything's, kind of unraveling. And I'd known that there was this literature on trust in society or trust in strangers or in most people, what political scientists call social trust. And then, of course, trust in government. I'd known what everyone known about trust in government was declining, but I never really studied social trust, and I didn't really know what it was. And I knew that something bad had happened to it, but I didn't really understand it. And it turns out that it's a far more interesting and important thing than a lot of people realize. So the way I think about social trust is it's our faith that strangers will follow established norms. And one of the biggest areas where, say, social norms and trust in strangers are most important, say, are in traffic, right? So you're on the interstate, you're interacting with people that you interact with once, you never see them again. You're totally dependent on them to not make stupid decisions. You've got to rely on them, right? You've got to depend on them. At the same time, you know nothing about them at all, except that they probably generally share some of your culture and views. And so social trust is the kind of trust that we have in institutions with people that we don't know, but whose actions are absolutely essential to our being able to get from point A to point B, for us to even survive or live our lives. And it turns out that kind of trust, is something that humans have not been very good at for a very long time. We don't really know where it came from, but at some point in human evolution, we started to trust strangers with our lives. And I became very interested in how on earth did that occur? And there's a lot of theories, and I didn't think Too many of them were very good, but I started, trying to learn more about it, follow what social trust was, work on the very idea of social trust, look at what political scientists and economists were measuring, psychologists, and try to bring together what was going on to sort of see, well, what's the sort of social glue that makes society work? And it turns out that when you poll people on their level of social trust, in most countries, it's very stable across generations. So, if you look at it, say in Sweden or in England, or China, places where it's just very, very stable, it just doesn't move very much. But among all the established democracies, that is the countries that have been stable democratic governments for more than 50 years, social trust in the United States had fallen from in the 50s or 60s, around half of people saying most people can be trusted, to about, say, 10, 15 years ago, to about a third saying that most people could be trusted.
What
So
were those
something had happened.
percentages again? What were those percentages roughly again? What
So
were the
we go from
percentages?
roughly half the country saying most can be trusted to a third saying most can be trusted. It's a very serious decline in comparison to almost any other functional democracy. Okay.
We have this problem worse here in America than in comparison.
Yes, and we don't really know why. We don't really know why.
Okay.
People have come up with all kinds of theories. I've been working on a big empirical research project now with the Templeton Foundation and the University of Pennsylvania in order to try to figure out, develop a theory of how social trust is learned and transmitted. We're working on that. But I've read a lot of papers, and people think it's inequality, or they think it's employment insecurity, or they think it is a declining religiosity, or they think it's a rising crime, or they think it's a decline in trust in government. And there's something to each of these views. But there's another phenomenon in American political life that is also unique among all established democracies, called political polarization.
Mm.
And it seemed to be getting worse at the same time that social trust was getting worse. And people hadn't really put that together. And in fact, even to this very moment, there's only 2 empirical papers that I'm aware of, one of which I think was just posted a month ago, looking at causal relationships between affective polarization. That is, we hate each other because not so much we disagree over issues, we dislike the other party. That affective polarization can drive down social trust. And one of the studies is in Spain, so it's not just the US. So I've hypothesized, and I put out the idea in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. There's an article that people can Google, just Kevin VALLIER, Wall Street Journal will come right up. Well, I put forward, actually, look, there's a bunch of stuff that seems to correlate that doesn't really work. Political polarization might be the key. And my thought is in the book that there's, and we're still looking at the empirical information here, but it's a very complicated hypothesis because you have to distinguish between kinds of trust, you have to distinguish between kinds of polarization. And it's actually, I think, starting to be borne out, but we'll see. We'll see where things go empirically. So the thought was, okay, look, here's these 2 phenomena that seem to be traveling together, and it really makes a lot of sense that they would. So for instance, you ask yourself, can you trust strangers? And people think, well, I don't trust Republicans. I trust Democrats, but not Republicans. And then, so the question is like, well, there are good people, Democrats, bad people, Republicans. So I guess maybe I can't trust most people because a lot of them voted for Trump, or a lot of them voted for Hillary. And at the same time, if you don't trust strangers very much, when you learn they have different political views, you might just think that they're rotten to the core, rather than having any particular wisdom or insight that you have not yet learned. So my hypothesis was essentially that these phenomena are in a doom loop, that we're getting more polarization and less social trust at the same time. And I wrote the book to try to say, okay, well, what do the experts in the trust literatures, in economics and political science primarily? I wish I actually, over the last couple of years, been reading sociologists and social psychologists, which have had some interesting detail, but focusing on the political scientists and economists, what I tried to do was survey the literature and the causes and consequences of both social trust and trust in institutions. to try to look at what could even be done to restore trust. Because, I mean, you might think, look, if people trust each other a lot, political polarization is not that big of a deal. Because it's like, look, people disagree a bunch. That's okay. We trust each other. We can handle it. Or we really, really hate the other side, yet we somehow trust them anyway. And so maybe the hate is kind of like fake or shallow or something like that, right? I mean, there's something about trust that chases out hate. And the thought would be that, if we can restore trust, maybe we can also address polarization at the same time. Because losing trust also has lots of negative consequences, especially social trust, because, for instance, you get less exchange, right? You think you can't trust most people. Why would you bother interacting with them? And so the thought was, okay, look, I'm going to go through the literatures and I'm going to report on the results. And I'm going to look at whether there are ways of, there you go, that there are ways of restoring trust that sort of fit with our ordinary understanding of justice. And I have a particular theory of within political philosophy called public reason liberalism that sort of gives an account of which sorts of rights and which sorts of governmental activities or inactivities are going to be essential for both respecting sort of justice and what we think is right and wrong, but also that's effective in restoring trust. So the book has kind of like a moral part and an empirical. It's like, can we restore trust? And can we do it in a way that is just or fair? And the conclusion I come to, although I was too confident then, because January 6th hit me like a ton of bricks. And then COVID. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will ask you about that. Thank you for being honest.
And then COVID just kicked me while I was down.
So you did write this before January 6th. You were already saying there's a problem. We need to dig into this before January. I want everybody to pick up on this. He's writing the book and recognizing there's a problem.
Writing in 1819. Yeah.
Before January 6th. So it gets even worse after he writes this book.
Yeah, no. So I was more hopeful because there are a lot of countries, and even in our own past where we've been much more trusting. And the thought was, this is so anomalous. Like, surely we can slow it down or stop it or something. What January 6th did is that it revealed something that I hadn't thought. My thought was that at least post-World War II, for about 30 years or so, we've been in a high trust, low polarization kind of equilibrium. Something had happened in the 70s and 80s that didn't happen in other countries, and that had made the U.S. go, we're getting worse. And so I thought, okay, we're getting worse, but we can sort of turn things around. But what I'm worried about now is that there are some countries that are in a low trust, high polarization equilibrium, where their institutions are a lot less functional, like Brazil. Brazil is very polarized. It's very corrupt. It has one of the lowest levels of social trust in the world. It's under 10% of people saying most people can be trusted. Sometimes 5%, 6%. Yeah. And so my thought was, look, January 6th said to me, we might be in that low trust, high polarization equilibrium. We might be stuck. Because what January 6th required, essentially, was low trust and high polarization simultaneously, right? Like, if the people that reacted on January 6th, if they had only been low trust, like in general, they would have taken sides, right? They wouldn't have been for Trump or against Trump or whatever. And if they only been polarized, then maybe they would have, say, believed the media reports or trusted the voting system or something like that. Like, you only get that kind of thing when you've got low trust and high polarization at the same time. And I just thought we were pretty far away from, I mean, people would say, oh, yeah, they didn't really win or they cheated or whatever, but it would be more like in 2000 where, like, people will sort of like, complained about it a whole bunch. But people, as far as I can recall, I don't remember anybody getting hurt. There were some protests with hanging chads and stuff like that in 2000. Remember all that? Did anyone die? I don't think anyone died. So somehow this time around, it was just like dramatically worse. And so I started to get worried that we might actually be kind of in a new equilibrium, this low trust, high polarization equilibrium. And then once COVID happened, it just sealed it because everything got polarized immediately. Like, what could have happened with COVID is we'd have like a rally around the flag effect, like after 9/11 or like after World War II, or after Pearl Harbor, right? We all kind of came together, said we got this like common problem. We're going to solve it together. Let's work together. Let's solve this. Okay. And that did not happen. And I learned a lot more about trust and distrust during this process. They made me more pessimistic. And here's what I really learned. I start off COVID and I'm thinking, look, I work on trust. I think about trust. Like I'm going to try to extend trust to the public health authorities. You know, they're probably doing the best they know how to do. There's a lot they don't know. They deserve the benefit of the doubt. Right?
Sure.
We all thought initially, like a lot of people are thinking this, right?
Initially, yes.
Yes, right. And as time goes on, you know, many of my classical liberal friends, some of them are starting to get skeptical, and I'm saying, okay, well, no, but we just out of goodwill, let's sort of. And then about a year in, I think I was too slow to pick up on what was going on. It started to become clear that they not only kind of didn't know what they were doing, they were covering stuff up, like Fauci lying about the masks situation. I just thought that's strange. And why are they not telling us the truth? Now, of course, I'm a huge proponent of the vaccines. I think Operation Warp Speed is one of the best things that Trump did, and he deserves a lot of credit for kind of seeing that there was a whole bunch of red tape that had to be chewed through and cut and removed so that people could innovate. But the way in which so I'll give you an example.
Please.
Once COVID hit, some of my buddies and I started playing D&D for the first time. And one of my friends, you know, is his wife's physicist. And so he also has a D&D physics group. And all the physicists were like, these models about disease spread are stupid.
I love it.
Like, they don't make any sense. Like, they're incredibly simple. Why are people making like national policy about this? But then the physics people like were on the left and stuff. And so they weren't, you know, gonna say a whole lot. So we kind of knew from the outset that like a lot of these models about predicting spreads were just like basically riding on an act. And so it was like, what's going, I mean, you know, so it's like there was no one who really knew what was going on, which is understandable in one way, but the way that they were responding was strange. And so one thing that I started to look at how these things were being handled in other countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, were Sweden. And I didn't really understand this until a Danish public health economist did a Twitter thread. Very interesting to me. He said, the difference in what we did was that the public health officials trusted the people enough to admit when they were wrong and to try and do better. So they would say, let's try something. And the Danes would say, no. And the public health officials would be like, it didn't really work. Now, of course, that's an idealized version of what even they did. But you can't even imagine happening in the United States. Can you imagine? Fauci gets on and says, we don't really know what's going on. We're going to try some things. We're going to see what works. We're going to see what doesn't work.
I like your Fauci accent.
And then 2 years later, or 2 weeks later, or 2 months later, says, you know what? It didn't work. We were wrong. We're sorry. We're trying to figure this out. Bear with us. Let's do this now. Right? So you admit error. Right? That's how you build trust, because nobody knows everything. Right?
Yeah,
you don't
that doesn't
lie.
happen in America anymore.
Yeah. And because the thought was like, he's thinking, right? He's thinking, look, if I admit that I was wrong, no one's going to believe me. So I got to like still.
Right.
So I also think, and this was also something I didn't understand very well about trust, was elite mass dynamics, perverse dynamics between elites and the masses, and particularly in the United States. So here's one thing that's really interesting of the U.S., which is that doctors are very, very rich, and they tend to live pretty far removed from most of the people they treat. I'm not a big fan of socialized medicine, but one advantage of socialized medicine is that doctors don't make so much money that they're from a completely different group than the people they treat. And so I think one thing that is so rotten about our public health authorities is they're really a detached elite. I mean, Alex Tabarrok at George Mason has said, like, the CDC is so institutionally dysfunctional, they can't even take responsibility for like the most obvious mistakes that they made now. And that it might be worth just abolishing it and just recreating a new organization in its place. Like it's so dysfunctional they can't even admit basic truths. And so that's what I didn't understand. But I thought, okay, look, the problem is that maybe there's a miscommunication, or maybe between elites and the masses, or maybe there's, we need to do things to raise most people's trust or something. But what I didn't understand very, very well at that time was that the role of elite and elite behavior in affecting trust is maybe more important than I thought. And there's starting to be some evidence now, some really interesting evidence, that the behavior of certain high-level officials really can affect people's trust levels. I wish it didn't. I mean, I wish the dynamics weren't this way. So that was one thing that made me a lot less optimistic, is because I started to pay a lot of attention to the dynamics and the dysfunctional dynamics of interaction between elites and the people. And so, that was, all this trust literature, it's all aggregates. And so we're talking about the masses. We're talking about most people. Politicians are going to tell you how trusting they are. You can't just poll them and then tell you the truth. So, I still think there's a lot that we can do to restore trust in terms of, I think, strengthening property rights, protecting freedom of association, making sure the sort of most basic safety nets work, having stable elections, having the rule of law. There's a whole bunch of stuff I talk about, and I still stand by the fact that I think those would help us, and that I don't think a free society has any natural or ingrained tendency to decay into low trust and high polarization. It's pretty much only happening here. But I'm less confident than I was, because the sort of the causal story that I'm now telling, COVID made so vivid that it just could not be ignored. And if elites don't trust the people that they govern, then why would trust run the other direction?
So go back to 2019, you saw polarization over COVID, principally focused on the elites and the public, but it's still polarization. I think you're saying the elites can be polarized, and it can cause the public to become polarized.
Yes. And this is important in a respect that most people don't understand, because a lot of polarization researchers now are studying elite mass polarization and the differences, but also the interactions between them. So elites are both polarized affectively, that in terms of their emotional states. They dislike the other party. They dislike the elites of the other party. But they're also very polarized on the issues. But most Americans are not very polarized on the issues. They're very affectively polarized. So, for instance, 50 years ago, right, interracial dating, very unpopular. Today, interpartisan dating is equally unpopular.
Thank you.
But back then, I didn't care. You watch opposition to interracial dating goes like this, and opposition to interpartisan dating goes like this. It's just an X. They completely displace each other. So it's a very real phenomenon among most people, but it's not really attached to issues. It's more just like, I really hate the other tribe. And every society hates the other tribe. I mean, I've had people that hate the other tribe. I mean, like, that's not unusual.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me
ask. Weird. Yeah, but we have it. It's got a weird form because of the way that our elites are polarized on a variety of different issues.
I hear you. There was Barbara F. Walter is a CIA analyst, and she has a book out called How Civil Wars Start. It's covered by the New York Times, a lot of other people the last year and a half. She said the same thing you did. Yeah. When they see how civil wars start, it's because there are these elites, and they basically exude these vibes that say it's okay to start talking and thinking about Group X this way because I'm doing it and I'm cool and nobody's stopping me. And it seems to basically, like we saw with Donald Trump, you may not say white supremacy is cool, but if you dog whistle it, there's people listening going, ha ha, yes, exactly what I wanted to hear. Oh, it's okay for me to talk that way now. Great.
Yeah.
Saw that personally. Yeah. Let me get to the big question. From 2019 to now, and we had Marjorie Taylor Greene come out on President's Day and say, red and blue can't live with each other. We have to have a national divorce. In your opinion, being somebody with two working eyes and a working brain, from 2019 to 2023. Has polarization gotten better? Has it gotten worse? Has it stayed the same?
So I think it's gotten worse somewhat, but it was already really bad.
Okay.
But it does continue to get worse. There's actually this group, the Polarization Research Lab, that has a huge budget to do online polarization research every week, and they're starting to publish it every week, and they're hoping to do it in perpetuity. And so I think in time, as they get going, they've only been going for a couple of months. We'll be able to just like watch our polarization measures update every week. So hopefully that will help us get a grip on what does anything. But so we'll have a decent measures and a way of tracking them, at least feeling thermometers at the very best about the other parties. So okay, so then there's this question: can we do anything about it? And then if we can't do anything about it, then what? Okay, so can we do anything about it?
Yeah.
Well, it's a hard thing, but I do think there are a couple of different ideas that people in the depolarization communities are bouncing around. But the problem is they're all doing a kind of this. This is not just great what they're doing, okay? But they're getting small groups of people together to talk. And they're trying to say, look, we're not all that polarized. People come away, they're less polarized or hateful. That's great. But the problem is they go back into their original social institution community, and then they just go right back to it. I always analogize this with my wife's a family and youth therapist. So she oftentimes is like, look, I'm working with this kid, but as soon as I'm done working with this kid, they're going right back to the family of users, and they're just going to start using again. And so the problem is, it's like, you bring someone in to depolarize, but then you send them right back into that milieu where everybody hates the other side, and they're just going to get caught up because we are social creatures. So what do we do if we can't do it bit by bit, right? It's going to require, I think, some changes in behavior among elites, and that's going to require both, I think, some changes in culture and some changes in their incentives. So for one thing, I think having different voting rules could help a lot. For instance, if we could have more than two parties, that was a stable electoral equilibrium like it is in most other countries. I think if we weren't just red-blue, we were red, blue, and yellow.
Sure.
That would help. And there's been some success, although it's been controversial with ranked choice voting, like in Alaska. A lot of people are starting to say it is producing more moderate candidates. So, you rank the candidates. You don't say who you're for or against. And that means if you're second place, you can win. But like in a lot of countries, you go in and you vote for a party, and if the party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats.
Yeah.
So it makes sense, right? And so, I think one of the reasons that many countries, even though most democracies have two dominant parties, there are other groups, and they have to go into coalition together publicly. So they can't just sort of trash each other as much, right? Because they're like, well, this person gets this cabinet post, and this party gets this one, and this party gets this one, right? So I think there's some differences in the way that we do elections, the way that we select political elites, that I think could change things for the better. It's also important just to remember, that we haven't always been polarized. And so,
sure.
Surely there's some answers. So then the question, so why would we be stuck?
Well, right? But before we get to that, what were the other suggestions on how we could change the election system that would somehow reduce polarization?
So I like ranked choice voting and proportional representation. I think
ranked choice voting. Okay.
Yeah, and proportional representation.
Basically, the way every other modern democracy does it.
I think our electoral processes are not the best. And hopefully we can get them going at the national level after people will have experimented with them somewhat at the state level. The problem is that if you implement it, both the Republicans and the Democrats are going to be like, well, we may lose a bunch of vote shares. So, but they've been able to do it in some states. So, eventually people are just going to have to say, look, the way we're choosing power elites is dumb because it's rewarding the people that are the nastiest and the least good at compromise. And so, you get people out there like Marjorie Taylor Greene, or AOC does a lot of this too, where it's
Thank
a lot
you.
of this is about celebrity. It's about likes and retweets and not governing.
Thank you.
I mean,
Thank you
neither
for
one of them are going to
making.
get any major legislation passed like ever.
Yeah, I
You
I
wouldn't even
appreciate
imagine
that
either.
you right. I appreciate that you admitted that there is some polarization and divisive work on both sides. Obviously,
Oh
Donald
yeah,
Trump was very divisive, but I get into a lot of arguments with fellow liberals when I go, so when AOC says, let's make a list of
yeah.
everybody in the other party so we can punish them for the rest of their working life, that's not literally out of the Nazi playbook. When Joseph Biden gives a speech in front of a blood red backdrop with 2 active duty Marines and says 78 million Americans are enemies of the state, that's not
Yeah, that
divisive
was real dumb
either.
for Biden. But let me say this on Biden's behalf. He's very old, and he
Sure,
remembers when the Senate wasn't polarized
sure,
because he was in it.
sure.
And um, he has actually been pretty good at keeping his left flank from getting much power in terms of all kinds of policies. He's really shut them down left, right, and center. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, for instance, got like nothing.
Sure. And he shut down
Um,
Bernie Sanders too.
yeah. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily good or bad. What I am saying, though, is that I think it's a little bit harder for Republicans to contain their right flank,
Sure.
and that's for a variety of reasons. Republicans are kind of because they're not a coalition of special interests in the same way the Democrats are. A lot of these groups within the Democratic Party are forces for moderation. So Black Americans, very socially conservative, they just tend not to vote on it. And so when you give them the candidates, they don't really vote for the kind of really far left folks on the the really far left folks. So what happens is you have the South Carolina Democratic primary, and
Yeah.
Biden was finished, and then Black Americans said we have to beat Trump. That's much more important than whatever Elizabeth Warren and Bernie want to do.
Sure.
And so there's a lot of groups within the Democratic Party that are that have moderating effects that aren't in the Republican Party. So the Republican Party tends to be dominated from the outside by like media, by celebrities, by special interests.
Sure.
And
Sure.
there's not a lot of there's not a lot of power in the party itself. So here's one of my other recommendations, long lead up. Other recommendation. We need to abolish primaries.
Okay.
I'm just going to let that sit. I'm just going to say that. I'm going to let it sit, and then I'm going to
I'm
explain
only here
myself.
to listen.
Okay, I have a piece
Abolish
called
primaries.
"Abolish Primaries for Real Clear Politics." Okay, from a year or two ago. And most countries do not have primaries for their candidates. The parties choose the candidates. The Democrats sort of have this for the superdelegates. And the idea is that the party elites, the people behind the, in the smoke-filled rooms, right? They want to win elections. And because they want to win elections, they will choose candidates to run that can win elections. And that means more moderate candidates. And so people say, oh, it's not democratic. Well, it's democratic. Like you have parties and you could be involved in those parties, right? And then they propose candidates and then you choose between those candidates. Almost every other democracy works that way. Some have primaries, but most don't. And the Republican Party, there would be no Trump if the Republican Party didn't have primaries. They wouldn't have had this problem with all these other non-Trump candidates not being able to coalesce. And in my opinion, I mean, I know that there are a lot of people who are fans of Trump, and I think that there were a couple of things where he was better than I thought he was going to be. But in general, he just doesn't really care about our institutions. He just doesn't really honor them or understand them or show any
isn't he who
consistent
the
respect.
Republicans wanted? I mean, didn't
He is
he
who
fairly beat
the
out those
largest
guys?
minority of Republicans wanted in
Sure.
2016.
So that's kind of what the public wanted.
But most did not want it. They just couldn't decide on who the alternative was.
Sure.
So you might argue that was closer to the will of the people, was a coin flip on among the non-Trump candidates. Now look, every modification of a democratic voting rule has costs and benefits. You can always imagine things going badly, like, oh, well, all these corrupt elites choosing these politicians or whatever. I mean, German politics over the last 20 years has been pretty boring. But people have gotten wealthier and done fairly well, and East Germany's been integrated, getting more integrated and further away from its communist past. And not that everything's been great, but like it's perfectly possible for a mature industrialized democracy to have a sane political life. It is not impossible. Germany had Hitler, and then they had Merkel.
Over a 40 to 50 year time frame, or close to half a century.
That's right. Obviously, you have a gigantic number of massive changes.
Hey,
obviously,
in 50 years, America could change. Yeah, I mean, if we're
well,
looking
it had in the last 50. But the thought would be, what were the things? I mean, obviously, we're not. Denazification mattered a great deal and had a big effect. But if you look at things like, I've just finished reading a book that was in part about the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And, the politicians, the elites were in place to push for German reunification when most people just didn't think it was going to happen, or that it could happen so quickly. But George H.W. Bush, to his credit, as well as Helmut Klimt, I think it's Prime Minister of the German Democratic Republic, were like, we can do this. Gorbachev didn't fight. And so Germany was able to be reunified, and then it created this kind of consensus-based politics. Or take less crazy cases. I mean, they're less kind of strange. I mean, you've got the Scandinavian countries, but I mean, even British politics, which can be pretty wacky, is just nowhere near as polarized as ours. And the thought is, we can learn from what those other countries are doing. Is really what I'm saying. We can just look at other democracies and try to get a sense and say, look, okay, we could maybe do elections differently than we're doing. That's just one series of reform proposals. But I'm also starting to hear among polarization scholars some really interesting and kind of unusual proposals that I think we'll start to see more data behind. So, Grover Norquist had that "Don't Raise Taxes" pledge before, like, Republicans would basically get elected to office.
Yes.
Or begin Congress, right?
Ancient history, Grover Norquist, before the Republicans picked it up. Yes.
Yes. Now, here's what's interesting about that. A lot of them kept to it, even when it didn't necessarily work in their favor, which is weird because we don't think politicians are very moral creatures. Right? Like, we don't think, oh yeah, they made some pledge, they'll just totally go. Well, it turns out actually a lot of senators, for instance, they don't actually change their political views that much. They're still pretty close to where they were when they were elected, even when they're really old. Most politicians are far from psychopathic. They understand social rules very, very well. They care a great deal about being liked. But many of them actually have convictions. They'll stray from them here or there, but they still kind of have a point at which they begin. And so some of the polarization researchers, and again, this is just still going around the empirical community, have started to think about, well, could there be depolarization pledges before people enter office? And there's certain kind of language that they're not going to use. There's certain kind of conduct they're not going to engage in, certain kinds of media appearances that they're going to shy away from. Now, that's the key, right? Is if they'll say, look, I'm not going on Newsmax because it's just going to be disinformation or whatever. Or, One American News or whatever. Or let's even leave them out. Sure, throw them in. They're nowhere near as bad as I would, I mean, with Fox right now, they just lied horribly.
True, but I need to point this out to everybody. Rachel Maddow was taken to a federal court in Florida for lying about connection between Russia and a company, and she lost. And MSNBC said the way they got out of being sued was saying that Rachel Maddow is an entertainer and should not be taken seriously as a journalist. and that they always saw her that way. Now, the liberal media will like to not bring that up and act like only Fox News does that, but straight up MSNBC and Rachel Maddow
Let's be
did it.
fair. Yeah, I'm all over that. Yeah, let's be totally fair. So
happens on both sides.
Yeah, we don't have like, they don't like, some stuff, is pretty clear, right? Like you don't go on Alex Jones, right? You just don't, like politicians just shouldn't do that. Some have, like Trump did a bunch, right?
Sure.
So you have to have political elites commit early on to certain norms. But the problem is the media rewards are just so enormous. And yet other countries haven't succumbed as much. And I'm still impressed by that. But our culture of media, it's just so much more developed. I remember I was in Australia, I think it was 2018, for their by-election. So they were having an election for both of their houses. And we turned on their public broadcasting channel. And you had a bunch of like frumpy reporters with a whole bunch of like papers about the election and stuff on a table that were like poorly organized. And they were just going through the data and telling people what was going on. Because they have ranked choice out there in Australia. You could vote above the line. They say, well, you just vote for the person you like, but you can rank. And so they've got a bunch of like nutty senators from like one party or whatever. So, but you've got a number of them. It's kind of weird. And it took them 2 weeks to tabulate the results, which is another disadvantage of ranked choice voting. You didn't know who won for 2 weeks. But the political culture was so different. I mean, there's sensationalistic stuff, but like, one of the biggest things was like, you said this and that was false. Like, I mean, it was like the discussions was different. I sometimes wonder about, this is very not classical liberal thing of me to say, but I should say it.
You are forgiven.
There were norms built up around the public broadcasting channels outside the U.S. Following the Second World War, that you don't do partisan hack work. Like the standards of journalistic excellence were just deeply ingrained parts of the culture. And it just didn't really happen as much because we had all these different channels. Now it was still very real, but but somehow those journalistic cultures kind of held. Now, what's interesting about the United States is that we actually had we've had trashy journalist cultures several times in the past, late 19th or late 20th century, late 18th century. Yeah. I mean, it might just be like part of, like in our blood, that we just have all this crazy, absolutely nutty sensationalist journalism.
Hearst and spreading lies about marijuana in the 30s. Yeah, you're right.
No, but I mean, even like the stuff of like raucous rumors about like Thomas Jefferson and like, I mean, the reason that Adams had the Alien Sedition Act is people were saying salacious stuff. So, you just kind of wonder, like, not that they were justified, of course they weren't, but like the point is, I don't know how deeply ingrained our like just like kind of trashy media culture is. It might just be part of who we are. I hope it isn't, because right now it might be being really dysfunctional because people are doing the trashy stuff around polarization. And I don't want us to have a disaster like World War II and then the Cold War that unites us because we're fighting first Hitler and then the Soviet Union.
Well,
I hope we don't need that to come to some kind of agreement.
Before we get there, I do want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
I am very familiar with what you're talking about. Ranked choice voting, proportional representation, more than two parties. About 10 of the professors we've talked to, I pointed out that when America went to Afghanistan and Iraq to teach them democracy, the form of democracy they set up was not the American one. It was the European one. So we don't even set up democracies that look like ourselves. I wonder why, because basically nobody in the Western world does this. They call it, I think in Japan, the American winner-take-all system. So I won by 51%, 49% of you can go screw yourself. Most of the Western world views that as insanity and nothing but pure madness.
And at the very least, just like not optimal, right? And we look, the founders were brilliant. They were very flawed in certain ways, but they were absolutely
Sure.
brilliant. But look, the first shot is a democracy is not always the best, or constitutional republic, just technically accurate. Like the first shot at this is not necessarily going to be the best, right?
Sure.
So, but I mean, I like that we hold the Constitution in high regard, but state constitutions change all the time.
But the American
And
Constitution hasn't.
you have had amendments, and you have had rewritings by Lincoln and FDR.
Right. But if you look at Europe, like France and some of the other countries in Australia, they'll have periodic massive constitutional revisions every 25 to 30 years. Jefferson said we should do the same. We have done none in about 200 years. So that's a big difference between us and these other countries.
There is at the federal level. At the federal level,
sure, at the federal level. And the other thing is that they've had these systems for almost a century. Yeah. Right? This is a new idea to us. Ranked choice. I mean, like 1930s England, they were doing this. So you're talking about we got to catch up to political cultures that have existed for almost a century.
I mean, the thing is, we've had a more democratic political culture than almost any country ever. And the hope is that we have it within us to make some of these changes. And I don't know I ultimately don't know what the end game is. Like you kind of wonder whether people can get exhausted by hate. One thing I learned from my wife, who's, as I said, is a therapist, is that that actually you think, like, a lot of us think like hating other people is exhausting. But a lot of people, I think, they just live with it. It's just like energy for them. It's just like the fire. They just keep the fire going. The hate is what gets them up every day. And I'm just not that kind of person. But I one thing I've had to admit to myself with time is that some people run on hate. And I know a lot of your viewers are like, of course they do. Like, have you met my ex-wife or whatever? But
no comment. We have no comment on that.
Right,
no comment.
Right. But yeah, I mean, and the problem is that you've got kind of the people that manifest that or stoke that, who just have the most influence right now. So I'm casting about trying to listen to empirical people, trying to get them in conversation with moral philosophers, political philosophers. The reason I run our program in philosophy, politics, and economics is because I'm really dedicated to bringing these different disciplines together to have a conversation. And right now I'm working at the University of Pennsylvania on a project on social trust. I'm working with political scientists, psychologists, and economists, because we're trying to develop, among other things, a theory of how social trust and social norms are related, particularly in impoverished communities. So it's a cool time in the empirical scholarship, because there's increasing money in it too, because people realize this is a really big thing. Like, trust research is getting bigger because it looks like trust in science had an impact on public health outcomes with COVID. So my hope is that with more focused trust research, and also the huge pots of money in polarization research, is that in the next 10 to 20 years, I hopefully will be part of a scholarly conversation where we're trying to piece this stuff together. So my big sort of hot take, I guess, is just that we're starting to see, I think, some reason to think that political polarization and social and political trust or distrust are connected, and that addressing either one of them, is going to require addressing the other. So really, I think, we've got to sort of connect those two phenomena in our minds, and that will at least help us get a grip on the problem, and the costs of not solving it. But yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things we can do to take the edge off, but I still think there's a lot we don't know, which is one reason I'm working on the empirical side on trust research right now.
I definitely have to say that in my little bit of a survey doing this interview series, I completely agree. When we were looking around to see, are people trying to have in-depth, serious conversations thoughtfully about political polarization, we found almost none. It was a lot of, you red state people are welfare queens, you need us. Oh yeah, well, all you Democrats are pedophiles, all of you, shut up, you shut up. You shut up into this. And I'm talking about Washington Post, New York. I mean, it's not nowhere. So I'm glad to hear But I have to point out of 30 professors I've talked to, you are the first one ever to say this is being studied and people recognize we need to study more. Out of 30 professors, you're the first one to go, yeah, we need to get on this. That's not necessarily a resounding good feeling sign that people get this. I mean, one guy out of 30, I'm sure there's more professors, but do people in academia get how important this is? Or is this kind of they're just starting to wake up?
So this is like kind of like my mission, which is to be part of creating the conversations. So like, for instance, I was hanging out with a group of political scientists who work on polarization. I'm the only philosopher there. And philosophers work a lot on concepts like what is polarization? What is justice? What is goodness? You know, we do this, right? We've done this for 2,300 years. And I said, you know, well, we were talking, you know, what's the big problem? And they're like, we don't have a sealed concept of political polarization. And I was like, hey, philosophers could help. And they were like, well, I don't know. So it takes a little bit of work to break down the disciplinary boundaries. But I think the more people, particularly we need, I think some political philosophers, but we also really need political scientists, economists, and social psychologists having conversations about these behavioral dynamics, trying to put their heads together about it. And so I'm always trying to, you know, get research projects going, to raise grants, organize conferences, to get those conversations happening. Because there are people that have these pieces of the puzzle, but they have to be brought together. And there are a number of different groups that are funding this stuff. I mean, there's hundreds of groups trying to do depolarization initiatives at the local level all over the country. And so my hope is that eventually these folks all get networked and then we start to really talk to each other. But it's hard breaking disciplinary boundaries down. So
my question is, I've seen Congress even did a report on how to heal the divide and decrease polarization, I think last year. And there's and I've read some of the articles on how to fix it. And it always comes down to the same thing. Try to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't think like you, try to be open to listening to them, try to, just try to talk to them and listen. I mean, that's what I'm seeing. PhDs and researchers, and this study said, and here's a psychologist, always comes out.
These are noble efforts. But here's the fundamental problem. So, right now I'm here visiting at the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania, which is where I'm doing the research. We talk a lot about democratic norms and the decay in our civic norms. But even the best polarization researchers all say, well, what's your theory of norms? Like, what are norms? How do you measure norms? They're like, well, we don't have a theory of norms. This is why I'm at the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, because this place has a global expertise in the understanding and international measurement of the presence of social norms. And so the question is, can that we put people who study norms and who study democracy and who study polarization, can we put them together to have the conversation like, okay, well, I'm working on polarization, here's what that means to me, or I'm working on social norms here, so I think about that. What's a civic norm? What's a democratic norm? That's a conversation that there are dozens of people, scholars who are convinced needs to happen, but it's a smallish community and it's still coming together. So
let me run a scenario past you. This is kind of a theoretical one.
Yeah.
Theoretical scenario, not necessarily this universe, theoretical scenario, so we can put our theoretical cap on and have a little bit of fun. What happens?
I'm a philosopher. This sounds like a blast.
Okay. So let me put a couple data points in your brain before I ask for the answer. So point 1, 2, 3, and then I ask for the answer, and whatever you have is great. We need to do these things. We need to have 2 political parties. We need to have ranked choice, proportional representation, abolish primaries, polarization, pledges by politicians. That would help us. And you're also saying, well, hey, we're starting to study it, and maybe in 10 to 20 years, we'll have robust research. What happens if we're not able to implement any of the political reforms you suggested, and 10 years pass before we really start getting that research coming in, and we have 2 more January 6th before we get that research and before we make these changes over a 10-year period? Is that workable, or will the whole ship come crashing down before we figured out how to patch a leak?
So I actually used to be more pessimistic about what could happen than I am currently. So,
Okay.
I've got a friend of mine who's a philosopher and political scientist at West Virginia, and he's convinced me that there's basically no country that have had more than, say, I can't even remember, a few dozen successful elections and that have a fairly high GDP that have ever stopped being a democracy. Like that it is a total democratic backsliding, like a collapse into some kind of fascist regime or something,
Sure.
is not really on the table. So here's what I think is more likely to happen. I think our politics will look gradually more like South American politics, where it's like it's more chaotic, it's more corrupt, it's less trusting. Institutions just get gummed up. They just don't work as well, and so we just start to be a little bit more of a banana republic. But it's not going to be like Mussolini. It's going to be basically like Brazil. And so,
Right.
it's not going to be great. It's going to be worse. And it's going to be worse for lots of people, and there are lots of worse outcomes as a result of it. At the same time, I don't think it will be the end of the world, but I do think I'm not worried about civil war that much. However, it would be such a bad outcome. It's still worth trying to resist. But yeah, no, I think
not civil war, but banana republic.
Yeah, that's I think the most likely outcome is resemblance of banana republics.
So hey, everybody, don't worry. America's going to still be here. It's just going to run as well as Brazil and Peru and those other countries before they totally collapsed. The countries are still there. Hey.
Yeah. So yeah,
I'm Latin and I studied foreign policy.
Yeah.
I know all about banana republics, and yeah, you're right. But I would also point out that once those countries collapse, they have a massive flood of all their intelligentsia and capital. So if America gets to that level, we might see all the smart people and all the rich people get the hell out. And then America will never pick itself up, because we've seen many of these countries, once they have what's called a brain drain, they simply just don't have the human capital to pull themselves up again. So even if we get to that banana republic and we're still here, America might die off the way that we've known, because all the good Americans would have bailed, which is exactly what happened in every single banana republic.
It is a brain drain is a worry, although we're very, very far from that at this point. The interesting question will be is if the universities are so polarized, the next Republican president doesn't start making them less attractive in certain ways. So this is one thing I think could happen. I actually don't think it would be that bad. It'd be more opening the door to things that might be bad. Is taxing university endowments. Like Harvard's a hedge fund. I mean, and it can handle, it doesn't need nonprofit tax exempt status. Okay. So like I'm going to shed approximately 0 tears if Harvard has to start paying taxes on its endowment. And so I think eventually Republicans will be like, look, they're a net negative to social life. So why wouldn't we tax them? And they're so polarized, right? There's so much crazy stuff going on at the top universities that the public isn't going to care. And so then the question is, well, what happens if their protections start getting stripped? And then you might start to see some brain drain, although I think it will be a while. My bigger worry about brain drain in the US is the elites being so polarized that they're not creative anymore.
I'm talking about a brain drain if we get to the banana republic status. We're not there now.
Get to banana republic, and
then you could see that. We're not there. We're not there now.
That would be
we're not there now. But I'm saying if we get to this thing that's not civil war, it's still kind of bad. I'm just trying to let people know that it's not civil war, but let's not act like a banana republic is a good place and some place you don't want to live if you have any talent or brain power at all. My family get the hell out. So
so that is a very bad outcome.
let me ask you a quick question though. This is the book by Barbara F. Walter. She's the CIA analyst for the last 20 years. She's been hired by the Central Intelligence Agency to come up with a metric on when countries will collapse into civil war. She and a variety of professors over the last 2 decades have created a series of metrics that basically, when you meet all the conditions, that country's about to go into civil war, and they have almost 100% success rate in predicting this. She is saying America is ticking off 3/4 of those metrics. She's also saying, she's saying, hey, I maybe civil war is not here, but I'm just telling you, our little system of you hit 12 points, it's civil war. We're at point 10. So whatever you want to say there, covered by the New York Times, nobody's calling her full of trash. They maybe don't agree, but they're going, oh, that's kind of scary. The other thing she pointed out was that the way civil wars happen is because of 2 factors, in her opinion.
Yeah.
There is an ethnic entrepreneur, as she calls it. Hey, our group used to be in power, and now we're losing power. And it's because we're Tutsi or Hutu or Midwestern Christian Orthodox white or you will have you. And the other people are not like us, and they hate us because of who we are, and we're losing power. So join with me, and I'm going to fight back to get you the things that you've lost. She says that's what you see, that Rwanda. The other thing she said is that almost all of these civil wars occurred in functional democracies. They were not super functional democracies. They were kind of this halfway democracy where, like, yeah, people vote, but they don't really think they have a choice. They're like, it's this guy who has a family connection. It's this guy. I'll pick, but whatever. I don't really think they're going to care about me. So when people have that kind of blasé attitude about their democracy, it's not a collapsed democracy. It's a functional democracy, but it's this kind of like, I don't really think I have choice, or they listen to me, but I play along. Yeah. And then you have an ethnic entrepreneur.
Yeah, if you get to a certain level of democratic dysfunction, things can definitely erupt. Well, I'll definitely read the book. I hadn't actually heard of it, so although it just came out last year, so maybe that's why.
We're not there yet, but I got to tell you, when half the country in 2016 says that's not my president, a foreign government put him in office, and then that turns out to be completely not true. And then you go to the 2020 election, and the other half of the country says, not my president either, must have been a rigged election. That's 2 elections in a row where half the country just outright rejects the winner. And that's both sides participating in it. Good sign for democracy or horrible sign for stability of democracy, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a bad sign. The question is whether the question is, I think, whether we get so. I mean, Americans, we're a very, very rich country, and we're also a country that has a very old democracy, and I think that to really depart from it would take a lot. But I don't know Walter's book. I just know some of the other stuff I've seen in political science where a lot of people are thinking, yes, civil wars aren't really on the table. But I'm not aware of this particular book, so I look forward to reading it.
And most of the professors have said what you've said. We're not there yet. Things are bad, not comfortable. But some of the professors who have experience looking at other countries have said, we're not there at the level of these other countries. Fair. My question, though, is that in a lot of these other countries, they didn't think they were going to have a civil war till they caught themselves in the middle of it. And then they're like, crap, we're having a civil war. I was just yelling at my neighbor. I didn't know I was going to start shooting him the next day. There doesn't really seem to be, when you look at the history of civil wars, a gradual planning. Hey, guys, next August on 15th,
that's when we're going
to erupt into civil war.
Quickly.
It just kind of like, I'm mad, and then So when you think about it that way, nobody saw it coming, which means if it comes to America, we're not going to see it coming.
I was on the Civil War train for a while. It was only being gradually dissuaded that got me off of it. But so maybe you'll get me back on it. I don't know.
Well, let me show you some statistics, if I may, and I'd like to get your opinion, if I may, Professor.
Yeah.
Okay, real quick. All right, here we go. So these are nice and good and scary statistics that I like to share with everybody. And then get their opinion. Because some people have said polarization is not real. It's not that bad. And I go, okay, well, tell me what this means. So This is a poll that came out September 30th, 2021. University of Virginia Center for Politics, Crystal Ball Center. 80% of Biden voters and 84% of Trump voters feel all elected officials from the other party are a clear and present danger to the USA. 74% of Biden voters and 78% of Trump voters feel all voters.
Yep, I've seen a lot of the stuff too. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
That's the poll there. You've also heard about the big sort, people
Yep.
separating themselves in ideological communities.
Yep,
That
I talk about sorting a bit, yeah.
This one is my favorite, landslide election counties.
Yeah.
You go back to 1992. If you look at the gray and you compare it to 2016, we used to have a lot of gray. Now we have almost none. Yeah. Gray was where you had competitive elections. Red is just Republican, blue is just Democrat. You can see where we've wiped out almost all counties where there's competitive elections in the last 20 to 30 years. New York Times covered that.
That's right.
Presidential elections map also showed that. Daily Yonder, Big Sort. Here's another. Oh, this is one I really like. So in 1974, 45% of Republicans identified as hardcore conservative. In 2016, it's 76%. In 1974, 28% of Democrats identified as hardcore liberal. Now it's 59%. That's almost a doubling of both groups, roughly from 1992. Of how they see themselves as hardcore. They don't want to have anything to do with the other party. Purple has all but disappeared. Oh, and this is my favorite one. So in 2012, about a third of people would not date someone of another political party. In 2020, it was 50%. That's okay. We've gone through bad times.
I mean, part of that is Trump. Unique. Part of it's Trump. I think if there's a non-Trump person of a Republican nominee, I think that may go back a little bit. Don't know how much. These are all bad signs. I lead the book with some of the stats that were present in 2018, 2019 when I was finishing the book up. And I mean, it is a disturbing figure. The question is, how much are people willing to back up what they're telling pollsters with actual violence and action?
That's
or
fair.
is it just something they're indulging? Because Americans are kind of lazy too.
That's
the national
fair.
divorce thing, though, is it's an interesting proposal. But I am someone. For my next book, I've been reading a lot of medieval history. And you can have leagues of lots of small polities. And so just because, we would have like a really complicated, it wouldn't be like you cut it in half. Like it'd be like a national divorce would end up being like a series of federations or something like that. You could do it. It's just the transaction cost of doing it would just be really, really, really high. And so it's not obvious that the price of national divorce is lower than the price of staying together. So the folks supporting national divorce, it's just getting a sense of what the cost would be pulling it off non-violently. It'd just be very high.
That's fair. That's fair.
A lot of these countries, before they do it, you have a partition. They just make people leave. So like when the population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Population exchanges to India and Pakistan were humanitarian disasters. I don't think they were quite on the order of like the Trail of Tears in terms of percentage of people that died, but it was really not good. And I could see it working if you did a population exchange, but it would be a humanitarian disaster. And so you could pay people to move, maybe. Just trying to figure out the logistics of making it work, I think would be difficult. Now, look. Sometimes cultures are so different, they should have their own countries. People have understood this for many, many millennia. People want to, groups want to govern themselves before individuals started talking about governing themselves, right? Peoples, cities, Sparta, right? Athens, they want to govern themselves as a community. And if we continue to grow more different, there might be some kind of claim of self-determination that peoples have. In the same way that we recognize with religious groups and ethnic groups, we may have to recognize that with ideological groups. We may be led to that position. So it may be the case that instead of saying, look, the Christians get their country and the Muslims get theirs, we do have to say that the Democrats get their country and the Republicans get theirs. We may get there. I just haven't really seen a serious proposal in terms of sort of what the cost would be of doing this and how it will be done. A lot of people are saying there's no solution, but it would be good to see like a book length proposal with someone trying to lay out how this would work. I would read it tomorrow.
That's, and the thing is that I have not seen those discussions either. What I've seen is we don't know how this would work, so don't talk about it, or this is stupid, so don't talk about it. And so nobody's really taking a chance to go, how would it even work? The thing that grabbed me was right off the bat. We've had 4 states split off from other states.
Yeah.
It was legal. Kentucky from Virginia, 1792, Maine from Massachusetts, 1820, West Virginia from Virginia, 1863, Vermont from New York, 1790, and you could also argue North Carolina from Kentucky, 1796, all legal. And yet not one article talking about national divorce brought up that states had been broken up from other states. I have seen nobody bring that up. That is a fact.
You could definitely do it.
30 seconds to find on Wikipedia. How come absolutely nobody in America was able to even mention basic facts about splitting up the states, but instead went to, this is so impossible or this is stupid? These are basic facts. It took me less than a minute to find this. How come out of 70 reporters, not one of them can mention it?
So one reason is that the people proposing it are seen as low status. And so they are ridiculing these people because they're low status and hate them. And so they're dismissing their ideas just because they're dismissing the person saying them. And I think it's also the case that a lot of the elites would be a different world for them. They would have less power. It would be, I just think the incentives are, it's not like it was in the Civil War where like one group was like, yeah, we're going to split off because we need our slaves. So, you don't have the same incentives among elites to split up. But you could, it could be done. I'm not like, you just look at any national boundaries of most countries, any of those time-lapse videos. They change all the time.
I was bringing that up. 3/4 of the nations today were born from secession.
Yeah.
There was only 50 around World War II. Now we have about 200, 210. Those all broke off from someone else. We have more. We have 3 times more countries born from secession than not.
No. It could. There's no reason it couldn't be done. What needs to be done is someone has to make a serious proposal about the cost, and then I'll have that conversation with anybody. Look, if it's easier than depolarizing, it's something we should think about. But I just need to see someone stack it all up and work it all out.
Let me show you a couple things, but first I wanted to ask you this. Well, I wanted to point this out. So when Marjorie Taylor Greene made her call for national divorce, she said, everyone I know talks about this. And she was roundly laughed at on the Young Turks and Breaking Points. And I remember Stephen Colbert went on the Tonight Show and he goes, everyone you talk to, huh? And that was the thing. Like, she's an idiot for saying this. She's probably got a small group of friends, but here's this survey from 2021, which no one in the media could bring up, that shows 66% of Republicans in the Atlanta, Georgia area do support secession. When Colbert said that she's stupid for thinking this, he never mentioned the survey. When Breaking Points said she's stupid for thinking this and talks to herself, and the Young Turks, none of them could bring up this survey that totally backed her up. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, the other problem is in the United States, secession is associated with slavery.
Right.
And so when people are proposing secession, it has these racial overtones. So that's another reason people feel like they have to ridicule it, because if anyone brings up states' rights or anything like that, then it, all that stuff gets brought up. But, there's plenty of other countries where you can coherently talk about this. Remember how Quebec almost seceded from Canada? So it's not racist to talk about secession in Canada. They're even more race. They're probably the most kind of race conscious country. I don't I'm not one of those who thinks that it can't be done. I just want to know the cost.
I don't know. This is something I'm asking professors. I'm trying to
Yeah,
build the questions that you're asking for through
yeah,
interviews. This is
yeah,
just something I
yeah,
found is
yeah,
that if you look at Texas
yeah,
and Georgia,
yeah,
90% of Georgia's red. It's
yeah,
purple because of Atlanta.
yeah,
90% of Texas is red. It's purple
yeah,
because of what's called the urban triangle between Houston, Dallas, and San
yeah,
Antonio. You
yeah,
could split those off as little states. The other thing these maps show is that these states are already broken up into water, power, river, transportation, and voting districts. And they're already segregated by like Atlanta and the rest of Georgia and the urban triangle and the rest of Texas. Why
yeah.
couldn't we take the water and power divisions already existent in all these states like Georgia and Texas and Illinois and Oregon and California and use that as sort of a guidepost for how you might divide these, given that those governments already approved of that division themselves?
Yeah. I mean, again, most people that you're going to ask about this are just going to negatively react.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
but in my case, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you've done this research. I haven't actually thought about how like water and power and all that stuff has been divided up within states. I just didn't know. So
I
that's the
work in
kind of thing
government.
that someone who wants to explore should like write up and say, look, we don't know how to depolarize, but we do know how to secede. And a lot of the time secession is bloody, but a lot of the time it isn't. So if we were going to do it in a non-bloody way, here's how it would go. Here's how things would look. Here's what the relationships would be between the successor states. Yeah, that's look, I want us to turn the polarization thing around, but if we settle into such profound differences of values, then yeah, it's like the Greeks living under the Ottomans, or it's Indian Muslims living under, I mean, uh, you know,
Yeah.
British Empire, but then
Or the Sikhs under
Hindu.
India now. They're not being treated very well under Modi.
Yeah, well, in general, a lot of religious minorities in India are being treated pretty badly
Fair enough, fair
anyway.
enough, fair enough. And I and
Uh,
I I want everything to work out too, but I also am a realist. I was noticing in 2014 that you had Congress say, we're going to do our foreign policy independent of the president and just go ahead and have the prime minister of Israel come and address Congress anyways and screw whatever the president says. And then we had the president say, I can make immigration law and I'm a
yeah,
constitutional scholar. And yeah, that's the traditional role of Congress, but I'm doing it. And I was like, that's bizarre. That is not your job. And that's not your job. And everybody's just doing whatever they want and nobody gets criticized. And then it got worse. Then it was Trump. Then it was Biden. Then
yeah,
it was January 6th. Um, and the thing I wonder is, can we make these changes? We have not adjusted the Constitution in 200 years. We have not had an amendment in, I don't know, 30 to 50 years.
yeah.
Most Europe has had amendments and constitutional changes about 3 or 4 times in the period that we've done nothing. We're also the
Yeah,
most unproductive Congress ever compared to the
yeah,
last 200 years. We can't seem to agree on anything or sign anything. And I just got done talking to a couple professors who were pointing out, you know what, if you're a Democrat and you are seen even talking to a conservative, you're done. You're done. Your
yeah,
money's going to be
yeah,
gone. Your allies are going to be gone. Your news
yeah,
coverage is going to be gone. You will not be winning any races. So we're going from a climate of I can't even be seen talking with you. We can't actually pass any bills. We can't even get anything done. We're the most polarized that we've ever been. But somehow we're going to fix it all in the next 10 to 20 years
yeah,
before
no,
it gets worse.
yeah,
I'm just saying, I don't know what the future says, but I'm going, let's look at these factors and let's look at these factors. And what do you think is going to, what about more of the big sort? You brought up Pakistan, India. Obviously, nobody wants to do that. But the thing with Pakistan, India, and their partition that a lot of people do not bring up, it was unplanned and sudden. There was no plan. It was kind of quick. They were kind of caught off guard. So when I hear about all these people dead, and I'm like, well, yeah, if you have no plan and you have no organization and you have no guards and you have no agreement, that's kind of chaos and mob rule, of course. But because they did that doesn't mean that we can't plan ahead. We couldn't have a 5-year moratorium. Hey, in the next 5 to 10 years, move to wherever you want. You got a decade. That would
Yeah,
be
I
very
mean,
different from
that's either a terrible coordination problem or extremely expensive.
fair enough.
Because I think a lot of people will be like, "This is my home." Now, look, the one of the reasons people died is because people were forced to move. The question is, yeah, the population. It's like the population exchange thing. That just seems not really on the table. You've got to be looking at a situation where there's new states with new minority majority organizations. But look, here's something I'll agree with you on. We need to be talking about a huge range of things that might solve the kind of conflict that we're seeing. And so, yeah, no, I think, at the very least, some kind of serious political decentralization. One of the most interesting things with the Trump justices is that we're starting to just see a lot more federalism, like on
Right,
abortion policy, for instance.
right,
And
right.
so, with a kind of renewed federalism, even though you have Gavin Newsom and going to Florida and stuff, like it's a stunt, and he can't really change things. He can have Disneyland, provoke DeSantis from California, but that's not gonna. That's so they could damage each other, sort of. But I mean, hopefully, yeah, with a little bit more federalism, maybe we'll be able to see if that's something that we like more than what we got.
So federalism could be an option to reduce the tension, in your opinion.
Oh yeah, no, I'm a huge federalism person.
Let me present a scenario to you. I've asked everybody who suggested federalism this, and I'd like to get your opinion.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there was this thing called Roe v. Wade, the right to have an abortion, and it was overturned. And then it got kicked back to the states. I'm in California, and I talked to New Yorkers. New Yorkers and Californians were not saying, oh, great, we have our own power here at the state. It was, they're taking away our right to an abortion. No, 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 they're kicking it back to the states. No, they're taking away a right to abortion. So
Yeah.
Nobody on the left saw that. You're taking away a right to abortion. They did not see it as federalism at all. Then you go to the right. And the Republicans, I was really disappointed because for the last 50 years, they've talked about federalism. Then the Supreme Court gives them an example of federalism. Here, kicking it back to the states. And what do the Republicans do within 24 hours? The former vice president says, well, actually, kicking power back to the states isn't good enough. I want a national abortion ban. And then he was not repudiated by the Republican Party and supported by them. So if one party has nothing to do with federalism and the other party goes against their platform of 50 years and doesn't rebuke that attitude, what chance do we have for federalism?
Yeah, well, I mean, the nice thing is that we're having it even if people don't like it. So I live in Northwest Ohio. I'm about 30 minutes south of the border with Michigan. And earlier today, I was teaching my intro ethics students about abortion and a debate about abortion. And this is a live issue for them. In part because in Ohio it's much harder to get an abortion than in Michigan.
Wow.
It's really dramatic. I mean, it's just a 30-minute drive and you can get an abortion for whatever reason you want, pretty much. But here, effectively, I think we'll see what happens with the constitutional amendment. But you may have a long-term situation where getting an abortion after 6 weeks is going to mount on the table. And so it's really striking. The difference between DeWine and Whitmer. So and they're the state parties. And I think, people think, look, there's different legal regimes that are empowering these different places. And it's kind of like, say, the border between countries. And it's a difference, and it's an important difference. But Ohio and Michigan don't have to fight each other over it. And I've been someone who's consistently been critical of Roe and consistently pro-democracy with respect to this issue for a long time. And my mind has not changed. I think it's been, on balance, a good thing. I think our politics this next election will probably be relatively healthier because we're going to be talking about abortion a lot less. The main thing the Democrats are going to do is they're going to be bringing up all these exceptions. And then if the Republicans keep saying no exceptions, then we're going to talk about it. But as soon as the Republicans go back to where they were like 20 years ago or 10 years ago, and are like, oh, no, rape, incest, life of the mother, those are, those will be exceptions. They go back to that, then I think it becomes less interesting. I think that's why a lot of Republicans have lost their shirts, because the state parties are extremely polarized. And the Democrats have been very, very effective at pointing out where the Republicans are out of line with the median voter. And it just turns out a lot of Northwestern or Midwestern Republicans are just not as pro-life as the parties thought, like in Kansas and stuff. And the Democrats are very smart, because they're not making the standard pro-choice arguments; they're making the libertarian arguments, about personal freedom and stuff. And it just turns out like a lot of 30-year-old Republican guys are like, well, if I get a girl pregnant, I don't want to have to deal with it. So that's kind of what it is.
When it comes down to me, suddenly the rules are a little bit different than for thee. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. One last question, and then I'll let you go. If I may, just because I got you here and you've been very, very willing to address theoretical topics and talk and have the conversation, we really appreciate that. This is a question I ask everybody. So when they talked about, and I know you're not a professional economist, I'm just asking in general. When they talked about red states may split off from America, the attitude was, red states are recipient states. They get more federal income taxes than they put into the system. And so if they left, they'd be poor. That was what people said. So the attitude was, if you guys leave us, you're going to be automatically poor. And then they said, end of discussion. But what I found interesting was that if you are a separate country from America, you could have no federal income tax like Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has no federal income tax and has sucked massive amounts of investment out of the United States into their economy. They are the only high-income economy in all of Latin America because of that unique position. There's also a country called Ireland, and Ireland had the lowest corporate tax rate in the entire world. They didn't really have an industrial base, and they became one of the richest countries in Europe. We also have the fact that Brazil and China both underwent massive economic reforms, changing the way they did business, and they experienced gigantic, stupidly large growth as a result.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that Texas is going to have any problems if it's its own country is stupid. Like that, no one should be saying that. Texas is not going to have a problem. Texas is going to be one of the richest, most productive, and creative places in the entire world, which is what it is now. There may be, I think Mississippi will have a harder time. But I think also it can adjust too. So yeah, I mean, the incentives would change, and there'd be more policy competition between the new countries. And so I think that could be a good thing for those countries. There's already competition between the states in terms of, that we're already seeing people leaving California and New York for places like Texas.
Right.
So we're already seeing it. If they were different countries and there were free movement between them, then you would see a lot of this too. So I have no doubt that the red states could make good decisions. Ohio would be one of the hardest states to really make it work with. Because like in Illinois or Georgia, you just kind of like cut out the one big blue place, right?
Right.
But Ohio, there's kind of a couple of different blue places that are pretty far from each other. So it's harder. Ohio's a harder thing.
Fair enough.
But Ohio would be fine as its own country. Texas would be fine as its own country. Florida would be fine, just fine as its own country. I'm under no illusions about that. We have the Vatican City. I mean, we can have small countries. There is Singapore. It exists, and it's okay.
I appreciate that, and this is why we do this interview series, because nobody is saying what you just said in the media. Period. It's you leave us, you're going to be poor. End of story. Don't need to talk about this. Let's discuss nothing else. So I have to ask professionals, like, if they change their corporate tax rate and their income tax rate, when they do something, can we say that there's something?
It's already happening. We already see interstate policy competition. This is one of the things the founders liked about federalism. I think one thing we will be seeing in coming decades is the gridlock at the top, at the federal level, will lead to more flexibility at the state level. We're already seeing that.
Like when the West Coast saw the federal government being bogged down, coming up with COVID restrictions, and then the governors of Washington, Oregon, and California issued a joint declaration that they were going to do whatever they wanted on COVID and ignore the federal government. So there was chaos, and they jumped right in going, we're going to do our own thing, the three of us. And that's just what we're doing. So deal with it. And people let it go. Okay.
Yeah. I'm not someone that, sure. Go ahead.
No. Please go.
Oh, I just want to think about the solutions. What are the options that we actually have, and what are the relative costs and benefits of those options? I mean, to sound a little bit like an economist. So that's I'm happy with that conversation. I mean, the stuff I'm working on now with all these new kind of political movements across the world that are kind of mixing religion and politics more, and how to kind of handle these situations. And I've already thought that, I already even suggested, and at the end of my next book, about a lot of really serious political decentralization. So I'm already there. I mean, I'm editing page proofs where I'm talking a little bit about this. So I'm already in that headspace.
Let me ask you one last thing. Is there anyone you could recommend who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation? You're part of a lot of academic groups, but we're trying to do, and there's absolutely a place for what you're doing in academia, but there's also lay people who don't necessarily have the academic background and need to be informed, and that's why we do these interviews. Do you know anybody who might be willing to be thoughtful and have an open conversation about this?
The funny thing is, I don't know if they would want me to name them right.
Fair enough.
So I need to think about it.
Fair enough. A lot of people say that. You don't have to name anybody, but if you would think about it, I'll email you a copy of the video. If you can think of anybody, we would deeply recommend it. I think we show that we don't do gotcha journalism. This wasn't
it was nice.
A trick. We just want to have honest conversations, and we're kind of tired of the media having a you're dumb. That's not productive. So
I agree.
Okay, last minute thing. I always ask everybody, somebody's watching this. They don't remember everything that happened, but they say 5 days from now, there was this one professor, and I can't exactly remember all the stuff, but he said this one thing I can't get out of my head 5 days from now. What is that super sticky thought you want to leave everybody with?
That our falling trust and rising polarization are connected. And then to address the problem, we've got to address them both.
Okay, wow, that was very succinct. Normally people have a speech and very succinct. Thank you for being here, Professor. We will send you a copy of the video. If you have any recommendations that it works out, we deeply appreciate it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.